All right, and give us a moment, everyone, while we get set up for the webinar. One moment, please. All right, and welcome everyone to our expert webinar, Mastering the Art of Problem Solving, Career Tips for Digital Transformation Job Roles. Our guest today is Dr. Len Bertain, who is the CEO of the Consortium of Problem Solvers. And I'm Stuart Creek. I'm a marketing manager here at Simplilearn. And I want to thank you all for being here. Before we start with Len's presentation, a few tips about how to use the WebEx controls. First off, place any questions you have for Len into the Q&A box. We will keep track of those, and Len will address those in the Q&A toward the end of the presentation. He tells me he has time to take quite a few of those. So please put those in the Q&A box. Anything you put in the chat box, if you want us to see it, please address it to all panelists. And as I said, we'll be keeping track of that information, addressing it toward the end of the presentation. We'll also be doing a couple of polls during the event. And I'm going to start with the first one as a practice poll, but it also gives us a little bit of feeling for the audience. So if you're watching on our streaming channels, you can put answers to these questions in your comments. If you're in WebEx, you see a widget now with the poll. First, how much experience do you have in your career? And the second question is something we've been asking during the pandemic. How are you doing today? I'd like to check in with people because the world is a very different place than it was just a year and a half ago. So got about 15 seconds left on the poll. And you see me shaking, it's because we have cats and they do knock the monitor a little bit. The poll results show that the biggest chunk of our audience are folks with more than 10 years of experience. So we have a experienced audience, but what Len will present applies to everybody here today. And it's good to see that the vast majority of you are doing well or at least okay. And we hope that after the webinar, you'll have some great information that you can use to brighten your mood. So with that, I am going to introduce, Dr. Len Bertain. Len and I have known each other for 40 years, and he is the CEO of the Consortium of Problem Solvers. He has solved problems for over 200 CEOs, focusing on problems that have 100 to 1 ROI solutions. And he'll address how he does that. Over the years, he's generated over $1 billion in first-year profits, over 200 clients. That means they have improved their businesses to the extent that they have made $1 billion more than they would have without his help. He has a couple of books out, including 567 Problem Solving, How to Solve Wicked Problems Correctly. And welcome, Len. I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you. Oh, let me unmute you. There we are. There you go. Go ahead.
It didn't share yet.
Yeah, it's coming. So, Len, how are you doing today?
I'm good.
And you should have control now. Apologize for the delay. It's a thing about WebEx is it's not really as easy to use as all that. Where did your tab go?
Where did that go?
You have to reopen the tab. And then go to View Present.
View.
Yeah, there you
go. All right. Pardon the cockpitters here. As Stuart indicated, he and I have known each other for over 40 years, and he'd asked me to participate in this program. And I wanted to talk about what I've done over the last 35 years in teaching people the art of problem solving. And the key to this is what I like to say is that we don't want to automate waste. In other words, you want to fix the problems first that have the 100-to-1 ROI. And then once you get those fixed, then you could start looking at digital transformation. And I would like to talk a little bit about how we do that. The bottom line of everything I've done over the last 35 years is I respect all ideas. And I really empower workers at all of my clients to go for it and to get success that way. And I'd like to just tell a brief story. One of my very first classes that I taught was at 6:30 in the morning, and I was going to be teaching the company about the Toyota production system. And I had 160 slides. We were going to cover those over the next 10 weeks, 3 days a week, an hour per class. And I'm in the first class, 6:30 in the morning, and this lady raises her hand about 15 minutes into the class. And she says, "How long is this going to be?" And I repeated what I just said, and it was going to be 10 weeks, and hour per class. And she goes, "Oh, God, is this going to be boring?" And I go, "Well, hold it." You know, I'm thinking to myself, this is the great Len Bertain giving a presentation up here. Come on, cool it, you know. And so I, rather than shut her off, I just said, well, why is that? And she said, "Well, I'm illiterate." And I go, "Oh, man." You know, you think of everything that could possibly go wrong in a class, and boy, did that one just slap me in the face. And it was like, it told me that I could not spend 10 weeks with these people blabbing up in the front for slide after slide for this lady. So I immediately changed what I was doing and used the slides as guides to direct the process over the next 10 weeks, and we solved a big problem for the company, and it was a lot of fun. But when I begin the process of problem solving, the first thing I do is try to get clear on what the company's value proposition is, what they do to value, the added value that they deliver to the market. And surprisingly, very few people are crystal clear about that. People come to work, they leave at the end of the day, and they don't even think about what they're doing to make money for the company. You just, you put up with the boss and you go home at the end of the day, and that's it. But what you really have to do is look at the value added part of the day. And initially, when I started this in that class, first class, I, instead of saying essential support functions, I referred to them as necessary waste. And needless to say, over the next 3 or 4 companies that I work with, that didn't go well. So I changed it to what you see today, essential support. And those are the jobs that support the adding of value, like accounting functions, the guy on the dock shipping things out the door. And then the question is what are those things that don't add value and aren't essential support? That's waste. And if you've got any understanding of the Toyota production system, they go into great detail about waste. But the very simple understanding of it is anything that doesn't add value is waste. So if you move something from point A to B, that didn't change the identity of a manufacturing product. Or if you're in a hospital and you wheel a patient from point A to B, that's not necessarily waste, but the question is when the patient sits in his bed and waits after he pushes the emergency button and waits a minute and a half, that's waste. And so all of the businesses of the world that I've worked with, banking, all of them, you have to look at the business problem solving from this perspective, and that's the way we started. I begin by looking at what it is, the strategy of the business. And you can listen to all kinds of examples of what it is, but very simply, if you look at strategy as the value proposition of the business, in other words, what are you telling the market that you're going to do to make money and to be a presence in the market? So, example, the CEO of a small business might want to be the leader in internal growth versus using external growth, which is acquisitions and whatnot. So if you're going to be a leader in internal growth, how are you going to do that? What are the things you're going to do internally to increase the chances of being the leader in that particular aspect of your business? And then, but the question is how do you check strategy? And what I've done over the years and noticed is that when you're trying to identify a waste, there's a link back to the strategy, because why is that? Well, what is a waste? What is a problem that you're dealing with? It's a waste, and a waste is anything that gets in the way of adding value. So there's a link between solving a problem and strategy. And I don't think very many of my clients ever thought of that before I walked in the door. And so that's what we try to do when we solve problems. We try to get the CEO tied in to the problems that are being solved and to watch how their strategy changes. And I'll give you some examples of how that happened in a couple of the clients that I have. But the CEO needs to know what his weaknesses are of his strategy, and that's what this is all about. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about why you need a problem-solving strategy. These are the 5 pillars of my problem-solving program for the last 30 years. the first 30 years. The last 5, we'll talk about that in a second. And that's more of a internet-based problem-solving process. But the first one is no blame. That's change without reprisal. Literally, when I walked into the first class, that hit me in the face, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But you have to have an agreement before you begin that you can put ideas into play that might impede on somebody's ego, and you don't care about that. It's not an issue of ego or protection of territory for a manager, but it's rather getting to the root cause of a problem. The other thing we do is look at empowered teams, and it was sort of a fun thing over the years when we've done this. A couple times somebody comes up to me and says, "You mean to say we're not just talking about this, we're going to have to go out and implement our idea?" And I go, "Yep, that's what this is all about." Because the issue is CEOs tell me, "Look, here's some ideas that I've never been able to get around to. See if you can get those in play some way." And I'm pretty good at getting people to buy into some of those ideas. And the CEO, after we've gotten them implemented, he just hits his head, "Oh my God, why didn't I?" It's so easy to get lost in the shuffle of day-to-day production and day-to-day activity, just doing your job, not thinking about it. But the idea of having an empowered team that actually gets something done. Then we look at high ROI. That's 100 to 1 for large companies, let's say Fortune 2000. Smaller companies, let's say under 200 million, I give them 50 to 1 instead of 100 to 1. And the reason is somebody said, "Are that large companies that much more inefficient?" And I go, "Yep, they are." And people say, "Well, we're not that inefficient. We can't find those kind of things." And I've been doing this now for 35 years, and I have yet to walk into a company that I couldn't find multiple problems that are equated to 50 to 1. And in a large corporation, I could be there till eternity and still keep busy. Then we have a 6-step process, and our process is basically step 1 is identify a problem. Step 2 is look for the root cause. And it's pretty obvious, you can go to the steps 1 and 2 can usually go pretty quick, but sometimes that not so, because you end up arguing internally about what really is the problem. You go down one path and that's what you think the problem is, but the real root cause, as an example, would be you can't get orders out the door quick enough. And it turns out that the setup of jobs internally within the company is like 8 hours per job when you can reduce it to less than an hour and speed that process up. But the root cause is different than what originally, and I have examples of that I can talk about, but it's a big deal. The third thing is, how big is the problem in the course of, if you look at the waste associated with the problem, how big is it going to be over the waste over the year? And that's what the $100,000 or the 100 to 1 issue is addressing, how big that problem is. The fourth step is look at the solution, and it has to be 100 to 1 ratio to the, let's say if you identify $10 million worth of waste, then 100 to 1 to that is you can have $100,000 of solution. And just, it's funny, I did a project with 5 years ago with a CEO and the C-level executives at a company, and I said, well, you have to find 100 to 1, and you have to have at least $1 billion of waste. But you can't spend more than $10 million. And these guys went, "Oh my God, we can't do that." But it's all a matter of perspective. And then we look at 567 is like 5% of the effort to get 67% of the benefit. The easiest way to see that is when you're writing software, doing software development, you go for 5% of the features that are going to give you the benefit and get people buying that software and then adding features over time. Google's really good at that. In fact, they've mastered that art of throwing a few features out there to get you interested in what they were trying to do, and the next thing you know, it's a full-fledged product. But usually 5% is enough to get people convinced, and that's what happened at Apple when they did the iPhone. They had 4 different groups presenting ideas to Steve Jobs, and they had limited number of functions, but enough to convince Jobs that he should go ahead with funding the project. Talking about no blame quickly, the initial time I encountered no blame was in the very first class when I said, okay, are there any problems that you can see in the business that we'd like to talk about? And all the hands go up in the class. I called on a guy in the front row, and before he answered, he turned around and looked at the back, and there was a door, and he was worried that the manager that would be nasty manager might stick his head in the door when he puts an idea into play that reflects negatively on the manager. The second guy does the same thing, and the third one. But they put their ideas into play, and then I'm going, there's something wrong here. And I said, he's worried about getting blamed and whatever. So I went put this signal or sign up on the board, and from that point on, that's been 35 years. I've been using this, and I finally registered about 23 years ago. And it's the basis of change without reprisal. You have to have an agreement on this before you proceed. This is a quote from East of Eden by John Steinbeck, and I read it a number of years ago, and I really, it caught my attention, and it really is something I believe, is that the free exploring mind of the individual human is the most valuable thing in the world, and this I would fight for. The freedom of the mind to take any direction it wishes, undirected, and this I must fight against. Any idea, religion, government, and then I put in, or corporation, which limits or destroys the individual. This is what I am, and this is what I'm about. Now, it sounds tacky, but on the other hand, it really is an important thing to do if you're going to go in and try to help people solve problems. You're going to get, if you're going to use people from all walks of parts of the business, you have to respect them, and that's what this is about. More about the 567. If you notice on this graph that the normal 80-20 rule, which is 80% of the benefit comes from 20% of the effort, or 80% of your problems come from 20% of your customers. The same applies to the 567 rule. 5% of your customers generate 67% of your complaints. But you'll notice that at the 567, it's very steep. So there's a lot of latitude there that as you move up or down that curve, you're going to get a lot of movement of the various numbers. And the way this came about is early on, when I was doing the war on waste, I didn't have a lot of time. And so I would say, the people were saying, I can't collect 20% of the information. I said, well, just collect 5% of it. And we'd end up with 60 to 70%. And I go, wow. So maybe there's something here. And then, so I formalized it. A friend of mine actually helped me do that. Another corollary to that is the 120-20 rule of profits. And the reason this can have negative numbers is that profits can be negative. And if you look at the three categories on the left there, salesmen can be non-profitable, products can be non-profitable, customers can be non-profitable. And when you add them all together, you get the 120-20 rule. But what's interesting was when I first heard this rule from my friend Don Bebo, that's the Bebo at the top there. He gave the talk, and right about halfway through the presentation, one of my clients got up and left. And he came back about 5 minutes later, and then at the end of the presentations, this was a breakfast meeting for CEOs, and he came. I talked to him, and he said, "Oh man, when I heard that, that just got me all excited because what he had 5 salesmen, so one of them was costing him a lot of money. He never wanted to sell what he had. He complained about things, how fast they got serviced, and on and on and on. And then he had another salesman who was extremely profitable and would tell him what he wanted, and the guy would go deliver it. And it was just really the difference between a very profitable salesman and a very costly salesman. So what he did is he went home, called up the guy, and told him, "I'm going to see you at 1:30," and fired him. And he fired him because he was costing the company a lot of money, and the guy understood that. And then for the other members of the team, he put the number one salesman in charge of the team, and the other three people supported him. So when he'd bring in these orders, they would get handled efficiently by the members of the team, and then he could keep on the road bringing in more and more business. Excuse me. So at the end of that, he always, whenever I had a CEO breakfast meeting, he always wanted to be invited because he said he gets ideas from those meetings. This is a thought that I like to throw out to people. What is work? Work is really just continually solving problems. You come into work, the order that you had, the part you had shipped to a client didn't arrive. The customer's angry and calling people in the company, and you've got to solve that problem. Or customer calls and it's a brand new piece of software, and you got a bug, and you got to research that and find out what's going on with the software, and get back to the customer. So a day is spent for most people trying to solve problems. Customer calls up to accounts, either accounts receivable or if or accounts payable, and you have a problem that you end up having to solve there. It goes on and on. That's what your job is solving problems. And if it's a simple problem, I'll talk about that. You just do it. And then if it's a more difficult problem, you have to form a team. And, basically all problems, are generated by people. So the corollary to that is people gonna solve them. And just a little note about the way I look at problems is there are stupid problems. Those are the ones that, we were talking about earlier, that part was late. You just do it. You spend your day doing mostly stupid problems. At least I used to do that. You get a little more difficult problem, you need a team. It's either inside your work directive, that's where you work, or outside your directive, you need to bring somebody in from various departments to help solve the problem. And then you get the wicked problem, and that's the one that involves other people can potentially affect somebody in a negative way. And you think of trying to figure out how to balance sales commissions, and you're going to end up changing the sales commission plan because of things changed in the company. and you're going to end up with a lot of angry people. So that's a wicked problem, at least from my perspective. and and then you have the homeless problem, and the constituents that are affected negatively by it. You've got the politicians, you've got the homeless, and you've got all these various groups that represent part of the problem or part of the input to solve the problem. Unfortunately, communities around the US and I think around the world are trying to solve the problem without the homeless. And I think that is the problem with a wicked problem, is that you really got to get all the parts of that could be affected by the problem into the problem solving process. And I don't know if any of you know or have heard of Occam's razor, but when you're trying to solve problems, you may end up with 2 or 3 alternatives. Always take the simplest of the solutions, and you probably won't be wrong. And I sort of look at, when you solve problems, people used to ask if I was a problem solver, and I said, well, not really, because when I solve a problem today, it's going to be a problem tomorrow. So I'm more of a problem creator. And part of that is that you never really want to do the 100% solution. And if you do that, you're going to waste a lot of time, and you're going to get on that curve that you saw with the 567 and the 80-20 rule. At the right-hand side of that curve, it goes to infinity on the cost side. So to get that 100% solution. So live with less and get progress towards solving the problem. I'd like to talk a little bit about why you really want a problem-solving strategy, and that is the CEO could see trends in the problems that are given to him or her if he can see how the people are down in the trenches and around the company are looking at the issues that are coming up in an inability to deliver value. And when the CEO can see those trends, then he can shift the strategy to reflect that. So one of the things, if you're ever, any of you are consultants or executives who are trying to deal with strategy, is that it needs to be etched in sand, not in granite. You don't chisel it in and anchor it for 20 years. It doesn't. The market won't allow you to do that. I'd like to talk about an issue as it relates to some problems that we've solved over the years and what it did to the companies. And that's to answer the question of, does problem solving align strategy with process, or does it align process with strategy? And I'd like to take you through 2 examples. One that gives you as an example is a starter remanufacturer. They remanufactured alternators, generators, and starters. And in that example, we were aligning strategy with process, and we'll go into that. The second example is one in which the company had a strategy they wanted to implement, but they didn't have the process to deliver against that. And so they had to change the manufacturing process. So they ended up aligning process with the strategy that they wanted to implement. The remanufacturer starters and alternators was a little company in Oakland, California. And when I walked in there and we were starting to look at a problem to solve, the issue was, how can we speed the process of manufacturing or remanufacturing the alternators and starters and generators that they were working on in a day. They were only generating 50 to 100 products out the door, and ultimately we ended up with 400 to 500 per day out the door. And the question is, how did we do that? Well, we knew we wanted to do something like a Kanban, which is you have two bins filled with parts and you empty one and you send it to somebody to fill it back up, and he puts it back in the back of the rack and you pull from the front one. And it's a very simple process. And it turned out it worked perfectly for this kind of a business. So we did an annual demand analysis of the demand for the various manufacturers of Toyota, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and saw how many bins we would need to accommodate all the different parts that they had. And then we set up cells with those four major alternators on one side of a work area and starters on the other side. And we just set it up and had a teardown. The teardown process is when the core came in, that was the material that, the raw material of the that you pull out of the car. That's the core, and you replace the core with a new one. You put it in the car and hook it all up, and the car takes off. But the core then becomes the basis of, it goes back into a supply chain that feeds back to this kind of remanufacturer that I was working with. And so what we did was we figured out a way to create a rapid turnaround of parts coming in there by simply following, simple process. And I worked with the guys. Most of them didn't speak English; they were Spanish, and so we ended up, creating a pretty phenomenal little business. But then one of the things that happened as a result of this, we got pretty good at remanufacturing the product line, but we also started to get some demand for some old car restores, that classic, let's say a 1953 Chevy Bel Air that would need a starter, or a 1957 or 47 Pontiac or whatever. There would be a wide range of these old cars that were being restored. And the people that had those wanted that turned around rapidly. And it was a new opportunity, because if you could turn it around rapidly, normally you could charge maybe $150 to $200 for the unit. But if you could do it rapidly, have it available when the guy walks in the door, he calls up ahead of time, says, I'd like to come by and pick it up at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And you say, okay, we'll have it for you. And you could charge $400. The guy is in a hurry to get going and he's willing to spend just about anything. You got a great market opportunity. So what we did is we set up a cell to do the remanufacturing of the old parts. And we set up a rack that had 400 different parts that we knew customers would want. And each part had two shoe boxes. And in each shoe box, we put one of the cores. And if it was box was empty, you turn it around and there was a red piece of tape on it. So once we got that rack filled with parts, then the job became one of negotiating a price of some of those old parts. When you put an order in for all, let's say for $10,000 of cores, 4,000 of Ford parts, Chrysler, and so forth, each of them about, totaling $10,000 for an order, can they, get the guys to say, can you throw in a 1947 Pontiac core for $3 or $4? And the guy go, okay, because that didn't make any difference. It didn't affect his profits. But then it became the profit source for this guy. So what happened is, on the rack, you ended up with 800 parts. And if the parts were less than $5, you could end up with a total cost of inventory of $4,000. So now the CEO or the owner of the business in this case would go out and he would walk the rack, and he could just go down the list and check the number of parts that he needed. And if there were on a particular part, if there were two of them out, he'd put a circle around it, and that would be on his list. He would aggressively go after those to fill it up, because usually they couldn't fill up one of the, they couldn't fill up the or finish assembling the unit with just one core. They needed maybe two cores at a max to get it done. So what we ended up with was the strategy changed from optimizing the manufacturing time. That's what I did when I first came in there. That's what we did. And we then moved the strategy over to now trying to optimize the core price to increase the margin that he would get when he would sell the end product. So that is strategy aligned with product. In the second example, there was a client they made oligos. Oligos are a chemical segment of DNA, and researchers would order the oligos, and they would be in a tray of 300 chemical locations, and they would in the actual part, they would order, let's say, a bunch of oligo segments, and they wanted them in a particular order on the tray. That's what the clients wanted, and that's a market they wanted to get into. So but they couldn't do it, and they didn't have the price to be effective to compete in that, because their old technology, their old process wouldn't allow them to cost effectively do that. They were charging, let's say $1 or one of the layers of DNA, but they wanted to get it down to about 10 cents. And so they ultimately figured it out. One of the guys came into me on the second day of class and said, I have access to a $3,500 gantry robot. And the gantry robot will allow us to get into the market of creating low-cost oligos for the research market, the large orders. I mean, these were, $5,000 to $10,000 orders. And it just positioned them as a very strong player in that market. But I need to do a pilot. And again, this is where 567 came in, and he said I could get it done, because as soon as he heard me say 567, he got, yeah, that's what we're going to do. So we got 5% of the features that he needed to get done. And he said, in class, I'd like to come in and take the members of my team, and we're going to go in the back room, and it's going to be a stealth project for 3 or 4 weeks. And then when we make our presentation, which was usually this was an 8-week class. On Monday of the 5th week, we did presentations to the CEO. So on Monday, when the CEO walked in to hear the presentations, the first 3 were well received, and then the 4th one was this project, and it blew the CEO away. And afterwards, he asked me, "Why didn't you tell me about that? You told me about all the others." And he goes, "Oh, I was going to be meddlesome, and the guys didn't want me there." And I go, "Yep, that was it." So the fun part of this is they became the low-cost supplier and became a leader in this particular industry with an idea, completed by this individual. And he led the team, and the team work with him to get it all done. You know, there were mechanics in the that he was working with, and it worked out really well. So my thesis is this: is that CEOs need a problem-solving strategy, and I basically laid out how we go about doing that. And particularly today, with gig workers and remote personnel, in 2019, we had about 36% of the workers in the U.S. were gig workers, and I haven't seen any statistics on what it's projected to be in the next couple of years, but I gave a TED talk, and the year 2025 was expected to be about 50% of the workers in the United States were going to be gig workers. So what the issue is hiring people. And the question is, do you hire somebody that's a good worker or somebody that's a good problem solver? And I say you get somebody who can solve problems. And, by the way, if somebody is good at solving problems, they're probably going to be good at getting work done. Let's talk about the sixth pillar of my business, and it's our video teleconferencing platform. In this particular example, we had a client in Paris, two in Dallas, one in Antwerp, and one in Kuala Lumpur. And they were solving a problem, and they went through the 6 steps of our problem-solving process. Identify the waste, find its root cause, size it, solution, presentation and management, and finally implementation and measurement. Now, what we learned, just as a comment here, that the CEOs that I'm working with now on this system are paying more attention to what I'm doing because I'm being more precise in the metrics that go into the 6th step. In other words, we're not just slapping some numbers up there to say, looks about right. These are, precise numbers given to us by the accounting department. People like that. So our facilitator manages and controls this process to make sure that everybody comes to class on time, and that ultimately get the CEO to listen in, or whoever the champion for the idea is. And so that becomes our 6th pillar. And it's the 6 pillars are the no blame empowered team, the high ROI of 100 to 1, the 567 problem solving, and our 6-step process, and then the video teleconferencing. That's it. Thank you very much for taking the time. So,
Hi. So, Len.
Yeah.
I know you have some extra time, and I wanted to see if our audience was interested in some of the other projects you've done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take back the sharing here, and I'm going to present a poll to the audience. So this is a choose 2, because we don't have time to do all 9. But let me put up the polling widget for our WebEx viewers. And you have 45 seconds. You can vote for 2. Please don't vote for more than 2. So if you can give a brief rundown on what these are.
Yeah, very quickly. I did a project with a food processing company. They did vegetable distribution, and they had a plant in Pasadena. They actually had 5 plants, and they consolidated them into one. But during the training, problem solving, one of the guys thought that, geez, we could put a truck out in the field and have it do all the collection of the vegetables in the field, have it set up to do the washing and ultimately boxing of the vegetables so that they go directly from the field to the store, and or maybe pass to the distribution center and then very quickly move out to the store. And so that was a very interesting idea. And that same company, there was one of the guys had an idea for doing a sous chef in a truck. They'd have a truck moving around Los Angeles, and they would effectively serve the hotels down in Los Angeles. It would have a job called a sous chef, and a sous. Sorry. And he basically got the order from the restaurant of how much, what particular salads they want prepared for your head, and they were delivered within an hour. So it became a neat little business that I thought was pretty cool.
We've got the result. We've got the result of the poll, and the 2 projects that people would like you to go into detail on are the angry employee who solved the hot jobs problem, and the rest of the story about the CEO who reduced the sales force and increased the sales.
Yeah. Let me take the angry employee first. Mm-hmm. That's one of my favorite stories. We were working at this spring manufacturer, and one of the employees, or actually a team of 5 people, were on a team, and they were not making any progress on the team. And just as a sidebar, is that when you try to solve problems and you're struggling to find one, usually if you come to work and something pisses you off, it's usually a big problem. And so I walk up to this team, and after being out in the shop floor with a bunch of the other members of the team of the company, and I saw them sitting there, and I asked them if anything piss you off, and one of the guys, oh God, hot jobs piss me off. And I said, well, what's a hot job? And he said, well, the guys up in front office, they get a call from a customer and they absolutely need something tomorrow. And I tear down my machine to respond to that. And in this particular case, the teardown was like 6-7 hours. And, he would maybe not be able to complete it on his shift. And then the guy on the second shift would have to finish it up and start the production. And so he said, what really makes me mad, that's not, I can live with that. But what happens is you go out on the shop floor right now, there are red tags all over of jobs that were hot last week or 3 days ago or 5 days ago. Then he said, if they were hot, why aren't they gone? And so right about that time, the reason this is funny is that right about that time, the CEO came in, and he'd been out talking to the other teams, and he was all jazzed because this is fun. This is exciting to solve problems and get the CEO all excited. All the employees, it really changes the culture of the company because, you get the CEO involved. Man, this is great. So he walks in and he comes over and says, hey, what are you guys working on? And I said, they're working on hot jobs. And he goes, and he says to the team, he says, no, we solved that problem about 3 or 4 months ago. And the guy's just livid. And he stands up, he slams his hand down on the table, and he says, we didn't solve it. You solved it up front, but not down in my area. And you know, the owner of the business, he goes, whoa. And I said, okay. And about that time, I'd been listening, and I sort of knew what the problem was. The problem was long setups. So I said, told the CEO, I said, I think we can work on this. We got some ideas to move it forward. He goes, okay, keep me informed. So he took off. And then I went out. Oh, excuse me, let me step back. Because the CEO said that they had solved it and the guy was angry, I said, okay, why don't you know, the CEO, you take these 3 people, and you know, the other guy took 2 people, and I said, I want you to take a pad of yellow ruled paper and go out and find red tag jobs that are still there. And they came back in you've only got 15 minutes to do that. So they came back in 15 minutes, and the CEO had his pad filled up, and the other guy had his pad filled up, and the CEO goes, oh. So then once he did that, he goes, I'll step back and let you go forward, Len. So what the issue was setup. Setup was taking 6 to 7 hours, but there's one of the things you can do in the Toyota production system is think through what they call SMED. And you know, you think about all the things that you can do while the job is running for the next job that's coming along. And those are external setups. And you separate those from the internal setups, the things you can only do when the machine is shut down. And so by reorganizing that and speeding up the turnaround of the jobs, we were able to get it down to less than an hour. And the end result of that was hot jobs. If it became hot, the people in production would finish the job they were on. Then the hot job would move to the front of the queue and be the next one to run. Now, when they ran production, they were able to stay ahead of the hot jobs, and everybody's anger went down, and everything was cool. But the issue in that particular case was that it was something I knew how to go about fixing, because I've seen similar issues in different companies. And so one of the things about that was really fun was it turned all those members of that team into, you know, they were all excited because when they gave their presentation, the guy that stood up and slammed his hand down, he sort of led the presentation. And the father of the CEO, who was sitting in the room, started to interrupt him, and this guy was confident enough that he had knew what he was talking about. He says, just hold it there, wait till I'm done. He said that to the father of the CEO. And so it was really interesting, because this is a guy that didn't talk. That's what he told me. I'm a part of American Indian. We don't talk a lot. And he was jabbering away. And so it was really a fun overall story. I hope that you get the message of that one, is that, you know, sometimes when you're trying to solve a problem, the people in the front office tried to fix the problem by themselves without getting the people in the shop floor involved. And if they'd have done that, they'd have realized what the real problem was, that the root cause was setup time. Okay, the other problem with the
sales, the
yeah,
CEO fired the salesman.
yeah. Well, when that happened, I went with this CEO when I was with him in the meeting, and this company made remanufactured airplane parts, and they uh, they would get orders from, you know, com, you know, airplane companies around the world would ship carloads of truckloads of parts in to get fixed, and then the employees there would, they break up the orders into different parts like gyroscopes and all the other parts that were part of the electronic uh, parts of the repair program. And so their market was international. And so when they would complete the parts, they would be shipping out almost a container load of completed parts. And they were uh, approved by the FAA to do these kind of repairs. And so when the guy who was selling would go out and get an order, it was a pretty complicated thing to get get the orders in. And the one thing he hated to do was spend that time filling out the forms and getting everything right, because that's not the way he was built. He wasn't a detailed guy. He'd get the order, bring it in the door, and wanted other people to fill it out. And that was what he got. He got these other guys that were more meticulous, were able to get the orders in. And the net result is they all made more money. I had a similar, just as a parallel experience in a, uh, 25 years ago. There was a computer store called MicroAge, and there were I did a number of MicroAge stores, and one of them served the aerospace industry. And it was the same kind of a thing. You had one guy that was really a good salesman, and then there were a lot of, so they set it up so that he would have two people working for him to handle the detail of the orders he would go get. And over the years, I've that sort of scenario fell naturally in place at a number of other companies. So the message of that was that the 120 rule of profits applied there as well. And just as a little, speaking of the 120-20 rule of profits, a lot of times when you're trying to think of how to solve, let's say if you've got one of the clients I had did roof trusses for homes, new homes, and clients would call in and say they had a bunch of job houses to quote the trusses for, and then they would never give the guy business. And he wanted to know what we could do, and so we actually measured, because this is the difficulty sometimes. How do you measure the waste associated with something like that, where the guy was giving you wasting a lot of your time? So what we did is we actually got listed all the clients that they had and the number of orders that they had put in for the year and how many dollars they made. So there was a direct correlation between how many orders a good customer put in and how many dollars they got from it. And then the other guys that put in, maybe the same number of requests and gave them no business. And the reason that was a problem is it was taking up capacity of his engineering group to prepare the quotes back to the home builder. that was doing the work. And so that's another issue. By the way, thank you, Stuart, for putting that up. Any other questions?
Yes, as it happens, we've got quite a few questions. So what I'm going to do is, if you give me a moment here, I will get those up and I'll be able to share some of those with you. So, we had an interesting question about the culture. Let's see if I've got that question up here. Pardon me for leaning into the camera. I'm going to ask a question from Wajahat. How do you motivate people to acknowledge and own problems? Sometimes problem owners hesitate to acknowledge and own the problem if they're aware of it, and they avoid it.
I don't. If you've got a problem and you don't own it, then I'm not able to help you. But what I try to do is, like right now, I get 5 people from a company online, and they have a problem that they've identified, and then they work it through. But if you have somebody, and over the years have been, people that, get angry when you try to implement something, and I call those people black knights because they don't want to change. And the term black knight came up. You could do a Google search on
Monty Python.
Monty Python Black Knight. And there's a scene in which the Black Knight is defending a bridge, and King Arthur just comes up to the bridge, and this Black Knight, is fighting this other knight, and he kills him. And then King Arthur comes up and he says, "Good Sir Knight, why don't you come join me in Camelot?" And he says nothing. He said, "Oh, well, stand aside and let me cross the bridge." And the Black Knight won't. And they proceed to get into a fight. The Black Knight loses both his arms and legs, and he's a stump on the ground, and he refuses to give in. And if you look back at that from my perspective, it's humorous because King Arthur could have just said, "Okay, I don't want to cross your bridge. I'll just jump over the creek." And the creek was like 12 inches wide, and he could have easily jumped over it. But the point is that the Black Knight denied that he had a problem. So, in answer to your question, if somebody refuses to acknowledge that he's got a problem, then you have a difficult time working with that person. But if you've got a directive, and so what I've always done is I've worked with the CEO, and the CEO said, "Fix my business or make it better." And the end result of that is that you end up with encountering a lot of 2 or 3 black knights, and even in a 100-man company, you end up with 2 or 3 black knights that do not want to participate in the program, do not want to change anything. And when they see that the CEO has got my back, they most of them back down. But on occasion, CEOs had to say, look, you either get on board or, I think you may find some other place to work. And that, over 200 clients I've worked with, that's been 2 people have refused to get on. And,
we have a question.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, we had a couple of questions about people asking about the 6 steps of
Yeah,
problem solving. Can you go over that? Because I think on the slide where it appears, it's kind of small print. So if you could go over those 6 steps, that would help.
yeah. The 6 steps are: one, identify the problem, step one. Step two is look for the root cause. That, like I noted earlier, is that it's not always crystal clear, but we spend time going over that. And the third step is actually sizing the waste. You identify the problem and you try to figure out how much is that costing the company in the course of a year. So, for instance, in the case of the uh, hot jobs project I was talking about, if you look at the number of jobs that ran through the business and the amount of time it was taking to do setup, the company was able to recover about 15%. The number is 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Um, it was about 15% of the revenue of the business, and it was a $25 million a year business. And, so that's a substantial amount of money to look at from an annual basis. And, so there's every time you look at a problem, you're trying to figure out how am I going to figure out how big this is? And, the most difficult question I've ever had to deal with is when you call into a company and you're put on hold for more than 5-10 minutes. What does that cost the company, and how do you measure that? And over the years we figured out ways that more importantly to eliminate that than to necessarily figure out how big the problem was. You knew it pissed people off, but it was not an easy thing to size. That's the third step. The fourth step is coming up with a solution. And then the solution has to be, has to comply with the 100-to-1 ROI. And that's, that's the goal. I mean, you don't have an option there, because if for instance, you find, $2 million worth of waste, 100-to-1 on that is $20,000. And when you try to solve a problem for $20,000 to get rid of $2 million of waste, it, uh, it may be it's hard. So I'm not saying this is easy, but it forces people to think of the problem in terms of uh, getting a high return on the problem. So, for instance, if you are working on a project and you only get 20-to-1, do you think that the management of the company is going to be mad at you? No, they're not. That's a good deal, because what is 20-to-1? It says you're going to pay off the project in 2.5 weeks. Pretty good deal. So my reason from the beginning for doing it is because I tried a couple of numbers and they kept getting bigger and bigger. And so initially I was doing 20-to-1, and then I realized, man, we can get 50-to-1 pretty easily, and it moved it up to 50-to-1. And then when I got to the bigger companies, I cranked it up to 100-to-1. And then the solution is the, uh, when you're, that's the fourth step. And then the fifth step is your presentation to the CEO. And that presentation consists of making sure that you've covered what it is you're going to do, what kind of implementation plan you've got, all the details of how you're going to get rid of that problem, or make it a substantial part of it go away. And then the last step is the actual implementation and metrics that measure the success of the project over the year. And that's it. But it's not this. One of the things that people say, they say, "Hey, Len, I've got a friend of mine who's a operations manager, and he would like to do something." And if it's a small company, I would say, let's get to meet the CEO, because problem solving ultimately, as I indicated in the presentation, is a strategic issue. And the CEO alone is responsible for strategy. Other executives could be in charge of tactics, but the CEO's responsibility is figuring out the strategy for the company and then managing it. Anything
Yeah.
else?
The sixth step is, oh, you just went over the implementation. And so, yeah, we have a question about putting this in the context of digital transformation. And also, you've done projects that have been in the quote unquote digital domain, where the
Right.
process that you've analyzed has been something like a web-based process, or a computerized process within the client.
Right.
So can you mention about something about that context?
Well, the first one was the example I gave of the gantry robot to handle the oligos. That was a, a big time digital transformation, because it was you're using a gantry robot, which is automation, to improve on a process that had been in play for about 10, 12 years. And so that was one of my good examples. Another one was uh, in the gantry in the company that made roof trusses. There was a gradual progression of a digital transformation of that company from where it was to where it was going. And in order to get the company fixtured into thinking in terms of the systems associated with automation and digital transformation, you need to complete the step of getting the systems working, so that now you know what's going to work and what's not. And in that particular case, we started at the drawing of a home, and from that sent the signal to the saws to cut the parts that were needed to go into the roof truss. Then the parts would go from there over, and they'd be marked with digital stamping to tell you what part it was. They would go over to a table where the people were assembling that unit would be able to efficiently put the truss together. And then the next step was automating that whole thing, and that happened in the next 3 or 4 years. Another another example of just sort of the progression from the improved 100 to 1 or 50 to 1 to an automation process was a company that made uh, andirons and fireplace equipment. And they did a lot of welding. And so once we cleaned up the welding process so that things moved smoothly into and out of the welding process, then it was just a matter of an easy process to put a robotic welder to replace the uh, individuals that were doing the work, because that was a just backbreaking work. And it was, the guys they had doing it were like 6'4", 6'5", and big, big fellows. And so one of the things that you then do is when you do the automation process is you have to look, once you've cleaned up sort of the back end of something, the back office, then you start to look at um, cleaning up then you have room for automation. But in a machine, I don't know whether I'm answering the question or not, but one more example would be the machine shop that I work with, the very first machine shop that we got setup time down to less than 15, 20 minutes. And then it was very easy to move from that point to machines, NC machines that would take the programs from the source, the company that would want you to make the part. They would ship the instructions for that, or the drawing for that part, over to this company's uh, engineering department. They would have the commands set up to do the cutting of the part, and that was all automated. And they could, the client was a very large semiconductor equipment company, and they would get the order from that that semiconductor company. They'd get the order and have a part back to them within an hour, 2 hours. And so what that did was it went from, you know, instead of doing batches of 50 to 100, they were able to do small orders, Kanban, to deliver the parts to the company. And then they moved up gradually into the automation, step by step, and uh, taking images from computers and turning them over to a machine, doing that very efficiently and quickly. But
That
it was
that's
they cleaned the business up first, and then they um, got all the digital transformation done.
right, and that's the whole point here is that um, if you start from the digital digital transformation or the robotic process automation side and say, let's take our processes and make them automated, then what you've done is you're basically applying technology to accomplish the same thing with the same amount of waste. So for the other example you gave, which was, how much does it cost if you're on hold for 5 minutes in a call center? Well, you can automate the call center, um, but if it's still putting people on hold for 5 or 10 minutes, um, maybe there's a little bit less labor involved, but the problems of call abandonment and customer dissatisfaction and all the other wastes are still there. So before you go into that automation, you want to go to the business problem, find the sources of waste, apply the 6 steps, and then,
Yeah,
like
I
you
mean
said,
it's
after you're cleaning up the business. Yeah.
yeah, it's is that when you try to understand any business, you go in and you watch what's going on. You see one person running around a lot, and you understand, now why is that person running around? And uh, you see things, but you get a better understanding of what the business is all about, and then it's what I call lickety split. But you do not want to automate waste. That's what you don't want to do.
Right.
And
We have we have a
you and I were involved in that early on.
yeah, yeah. We have some questions regarding how you'd advise somebody to become a better problem solver, what the skill set is for the problem solver, and especially one of our YouTube audience asked what you'd advise young persons to do in terms of the kinds of projects they'd look to become part of to solve and exercise those skills.
Um, First of all, if you want to become a better problem solver, you have to almost follow the rules that I laid out. You have to be open to listening to other people. You know, if you go in to the problem solving process thinking you're the smartest person in the room, it ain't going to work. And so what I try to encourage people to keep an open mind, um, because that you know everybody has an input, and I over the years I've just been blown away by the insight that some low-level manager had, low-level person had, that was very insightful. And so you want to accept that idea. Then you also have to really work from the no blame and understand what that means is that you cannot be in a position to either blame or lay guilt on someone for having managed something, especially if you're a manager and you're trying to get people to solve problems for you. But the most important thing is understanding that, let's say if you go back to your job and you say, geez, I listened to Len and he was all excited about problem solving, and he gave us some ideas about what problems that we could attack. And so if you want to attack a problem, find a champion. Don't try to do it yourself. I mean, if you I mean, businesses are uh, rife with people that want to, cut your legs out from under you if you're not tactical, uh, tactical about what you're doing. So you want to find somebody that's going to support your effort. That's a champion. And then once you've gotten that person on board, and um, you know, then you can proceed to follow the process I laid out. The 6 steps. And if you get hung up in an issue, I said just email me, and I'll give my 10 cents and help you, just for having listened to me for an hour.
Last question I'm going to ask, because we're reaching 90 minutes. Alejandra asks, some organizations have a conflict of interest on certain issues, and individuals may not be focused on the greater good for the company. So how do you deal with that if you're in the company, you're trying to solve problems, and you find either people next to you, above you, below you are engaged in that kind of self-serving um, behavior?
I every group, every company has its own culture, and people behave to new ideas in lots of different ways for lots of different reasons. And and when you when you're trying to deal with people that are unwilling to work with you or unwilling to support you, there's bound to be other people that will work with you. And uh, that's why I'm saying, if you have an idea that you want to work on, find a champion. And that's, I mean, I have, from my experiences now, after having been doing this for 35 years, I wouldn't try anything without getting a champion behind me that was really wanting to support what I was trying to do.
And that and
And
that and the ideal champion is, the CEO of the company or that type of thing, right?
right, the ideal is the CEO, and a lot of times, if you want to embolden your presence with the CEO, you can always do this, and CEOs are always excited about people that want to go take on a challenge. Um, but the key to trying to any of these things is the 567. Is that, when you make your case, look at I listened to Len talk, and he's big into the 567. You can buy my book and read about it, or you can go to the internet and find a YouTube um, pitch that I give, and you can find more about the 567 and understand what it is. But it's when you go to a CEO and talk to him about that, and he goes, oh, that's interesting, and then uh, and then it'll noodle for a couple of days, and maybe he'll get back to you and say go forward. Um, but as far as advice, uh, I don't ever know what the best advice to anyone is when it comes to getting started. Once you get started, I go to end of the CEO and I work down from there. But a lot of times, you're in a big enough company where you can't get to the CEO, but you could find somebody else that's high level to support the idea. And if for instance, if you just took what I did with the 567, but the 6 steps, and you outlined your idea in a memo to somebody, um, to tell them what you'd been, if you do the preliminary work on it and write it up. I said, I need more time to collect with a team to collect the more accurate data for you, but this is a sketch of what the problem might look like. And the guy goes, wow. You'd be surprised when you just do that, if you think about the problem you're thinking of and in those terms and just sort of size it, how much it's costing the company in a year.
Yep.
I worked at a semiconductor company, and I'd go to meetings, and um, I kept track of every single meeting I went to for 6 months. And I get there at 10 o'clock, and people would meander in 15 minutes later, and then the meeting would start. And I kept track of all those. And if I got there at 10 and then people meandered in at 5 minutes late, then that was only a waste of 5 minutes per person that wandered in at that time. Then if somebody wandered in at 8 minutes and so forth, I kept track of all that. And then at the end of 6 months, I totaled it and sent it to the CEO, and he went absolutely bonkers. And so from that point forward, the rule is you get to meetings on time. You don't schedule meetings back to back to back to back. You and even to this day, if you go down to this company, you can see a signal sign in every room, basically caused by my data. But um, when people uh, are wasting people's time, and what's that translate into? That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And I mean, but also you can be a pariah if you do that. You, you do something like that, people are going to, which they did a little bit, but they knew I was petulant, so that was okay.
All right. Len has offered that we'll take the questions that we've been collecting from the audience, and I'll send those to him, and he'll be able to send us a follow-up about a week from now. But in the meantime, it's all the time we have for the live questions. So I'm going to go ahead and run one last quick poll about um, people's interests in learning. And we have been putting into the chat window some links to Simplilearn programs. But let's run this quick poll, and the different skills that you can look into. that will help you in the world of digital transformation and the digital economy, and some idea of when you would like to get started in learning about them. Sorry, used my mouse wheel the wrong time. And we'll close the poll in 5 seconds. And not surprisingly for this audience, business and project management is the most interesting subject for people. And about 40% of you said you'd like to get started right away, which is always a good idea. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to Len. Here's his LinkedIn information. It's just basically Len Bertain at linkedin.com.
You can also
go ahead.
You can also just get me by emailing me Len at Bertain.com.
That's pretty straightforward.
That's pretty
And
straightforward.
I want to thank Len for being here today and being very generous with his time. We've got a lot of comments from people about how much they've appreciated this session. So thank you, Len. I want to mention again the Skill Up program that we have, which is access to our training content for free. It includes our video content for self-study, so it gives you a flavor for the actual courses we provide. We do give you a completion certificate if you complete a self-study program through Skill Up. And again, it's a free program, covers hundreds of skills and thousands of hours of video content. I've dropped a link into the chat a few times, so you can check that. And you can keep track of us at our social media handles, Simplilearn, at Simplilearn on Facebook and Twitter, and we're Simplilearn on LinkedIn as well. We have another webinar coming up, and we'll try to include information about that in the follow-up email from this webinar, which will include a link to the recording here. I know a number of you have asked about getting the slide deck from Len. It's proprietary information, so we can't share that. But we will share the link to this recording so that you can review the information at your leisure. And with that, the webinar is concluded. So I thank you all for being here and sticking through to the end. And we hope to see you at future Simplilearn webinars.